Vulnerability, fragility, and risk are no new concerns in reproductive narratives. However, what's new is an increasingly controlling and morally demanding discourse concerning the unborn child. Ultrasound imaging and other biomedical practices in prenatal care have increasingly fostered a reproductive imaginary which pictures the fetus simultaneously as a person and as prone to human deviation as, for example, the alien, the animal, or the monstrous. The fetal figure has thus come to play a crucial role in the construction of a fragile yet increasingly restrictive human future, in which the attention to individual bodies and fetuses as sites of precarity blinds us to the cultural sources of anxiety, distress, risk, and loss bound up with all embodiment. Such reproductive discourses and practices make effective use of concepts like, for example, vulnerability, which is my main theme, care and empathy in ways that sentimentalize and moralize the relation between expectant parent and unborn life. In this paper, I aim to expose and counter specifically the growing attention to fetal vulnerability in the dominant cultural imaginary. An imaginary that is reinforced by the visualization of fetal life through ultrasound imaging and is likely to reproduce an ableist, heteronormative, and moralizing discourse of the as yet unavailable life. With the help of queer post-human literary narratives of reproduction, I hope to draw out the possibilities for alternative reproductive imaginaries, which not only offer new ways of imagining unborn life beyond visuality, so therefore literary, but which also critically reflect about the potentially dangerous effects of a discourse of vulnerability in the figure of what Donna Haraway has called the biomedical public fetus. I am especially interested in revealing the paradoxical role of vulnerability in what I would call its hegemonic disguise. So, as vulnerability has been used in critical theory for many years now, starting also, for example, famously with Judith Butler's theories, I'm making an argument for saying that vulnerability has also been used in its hegemonic version, which would be the uncritical one, and the sphere that I'm talking about is dealing with that. So my concern is that vulnerability has been increasingly used not as a concept, but as a new norm in prenatal biomedical care and cultural discourse. This construction of vulnerability as a norm is worrying insofar as it helps to foster already existing bodily norms and exclusions also in the as yet unborn life. With this concern in mind, I want to first look at the effects of some visualizing techniques around prenatal care, which must make us alert to the connection between vulnerability as norm and current visual practices. Secondly, I will analyze a few passages from a work of fiction called With Animal, in which pregnancy experiences are imagined rather differently with the help of animal fetuses. These literary imaginations, I argue, allow us to relate to the figure of the fetus in more creative and affective ways. The goal of this paper will be to shed some light on vulnerability as the new norm. I want to ask, what effects does the construction of fetal vulnerability have for the experience of embodied vulnerability and an adequately social response to fragile subjects and groups? And if we want to counter such normative conception of vulnerability, how do we produce a sense of vulnerability that is A, inherently embodied, affective, and relational, B, not dependent on the rather artificial construction of fetal autonomy and personhood, C, does not identify vulnerable subjects or groups through universalizing principles, and finally, that allows to relate critically to fetal images produced and interpreted by biomedical standards. Yeah, so this works. I'm just going to show a few slides of something that was brought to me, to my attention by an Australian feminist bioethicist, Catherine Mills, who has been talking about this device, which apparently is a design, it's a device that has been designed but maybe not produced yet. I couldn't find any information about the fact that they have already produced it, but it exists as a designed object and maybe already a machine, which is kind of an ultrasound device that pregnant women can put around their bellies, and it is being promoted in very specific ways, and these ways, I'm arguing, have to do very much with how visuality and visual technology have been used in reproductive discourse, and it's quite worrying. So this might be kind of the extreme version of what I'm saying about prenatal care. So if you look on the website of this device and how it's been promoted, you can read also some of the text, which is in itself quite interesting. So I'm just reading part of it, which says, "The product represents design excellence and certainly deserves an Australian Design Award, as it paves the way for fetal-maternal bonding in order to keep the mothers in an optimistic state of mind. Establishing early bonding essentially sustains the maternal relationship post-birth and helps delivering a healthy child. The father also gets an opportunity to watch the current activity of his child and participate in the process of bonding." Okay, so this is the text which in itself, I think, I heard you laugh, so I think you kind of got the irony of what he's saying, but I also want to look at the picture, and there's some other pictures as well of on that website, but this one is the most striking one, I think, because it actually, when I first looked at it, it looked to me as if they were having sex, and then, of course, in a very special position. But no, so they're not having sex, but at the same time, of course, the woman is kind of sitting in a chair as if she were at the doctor's office, and the father, or future father, is coming very, very close in a very intimate kind of posture, but also in a almost kind of overbearing posture. And if we think of medical doctors and obstetricians still very often being men as well, you could almost kind of exchange the father's role with the obstetrician's role, and then it becomes even more worrying. So, so this is just to show you how I think this trend is going, or towards where this trend is going, of that kind of. So talking about education, so the fetus has to be educated already as a fetus, so it's really read to, or has to even kind of read. All right. Let me briefly relate to bioethics as an important field of research in prenatal care. Bioethics critically informs and regulates biomedical practices by revisiting common concepts and discourses. Vulnerability is a key concept in bioethics, as it helps to identify vulnerable subjects in the context of public health care and medical practice. However, in bioethics, according to feminist bioethicist Wendy Rogers, the concept of vulnerability is under-theorized and normative. It is thus no surprise that bioethicists, as well as biomedical discourse, treat the unborn fetus as vulnerable without considering the underlying assumptions that such an attribution draws on. So to identify the fetus as vulnerable is conditioned on the construction of him or her, and note the gender pronoun here, as a person which can be protected against harm and whose autonomy is in danger of being threatened. The protection against this threat is the mother's moral responsibility and the doctor's professional expertise. By way of mostly visualizing technologies in prenatal care, the fetus is not so much monitored but seemingly protected against the unknown. Such construction of fetal personhood not only feeds into religious and conservative sentiments against abortion, but it also problematically creates a discursively and technologically mediated persona for the mother. So the fetus becomes that technologically mediated persona. As Donna Haraway has observed already in the late 1990s, I quote, "The ubiquitous images of glowing, free-floating human fetuses condense and intensify struggles over a new and disruptive technoscientific object of knowledge, namely life itself." End of quote. The vulnerable fetus, visually mediated and promoted, has become one of the heroic public figures of humanity's future. So these are some of the images that some of you might have experienced yourself in the doctor's practice, but also these images are circulated widely on the internet in all kinds of media. So it's not only the mother's first baby picture, but it's also a public picture. So that's Haraway's point, where she says the fetus has become a global figure. Haraway observed that this new global fetus is mainly the outcome of technoscientific visual culture. Visual culture produces and mediates fetal images with the help of video cameras, computers, sonography machines, optical fiber technologies, microcinematography, etc. And we should be worried about these images' ideological power. So these are not just images of fetuses, but they come with their own ideological baggage, which are then, produce the effect of being interpreted in very specific ways. Donna Haraway's critical response to the medical technology and the fetus as public object is by way of an ironic cartoon called The Virtual Speculum, in which we see the expectant mother-to-be, on the one hand, in control of, and literally in touch with the baby's picture through the mouse, playing the role of the doctor, and, on the other hand, symbolizing Adam as she is created by the godlike power of the fetus/computer. So this is the image that this image refers to. Of course, we all know it. I am quoting here Haraway's reading of this image, which is a cartoon by Anne Kelly named The Virtual Speculum. It is a representation of Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The Virtual Speculum is a caricature in the potent political tradition of literal reversals, which excavates the latent and implicit oppositions that made the original picture work. In Kelly's version, a female nude is in the position of Adam, whose hand is extended to the creative interface with a keyboard for a computer whose display screen shows the global digital fetus in its amniotic sac. A female Adam, the young nude woman, is in the position of the first man. Kelly's cartoon works off of the fact that in many contemporary technologically mediated pregnancies, expectant mothers emotionally bond with their fetuses through learning to see the developing child on screen during a sonogram. And so do fathers, as well as members of the Parliament and Congress. The sonogram is only one in a battery of visual artifacts that establish the fact of fetal life within political, personal, and biomedical discourse. Selves and subjects are produced in such lived experience. End of quote. I want to argue that these selves and subjects are constructed on the background of fetal vulnerability, which in turn reproduces hegemonic corporealities, excluding more powerfully than ever the fact that all bodies are vulnerable to different degrees. Haraway's attack on the power of visualizing technologies as they have been used already in the late 1990s is a fight for the recognition of women's bodies' vulnerability, rather than against the conception of fetal vulnerability. Today, I believe, we must critically look at how and in the name of whom vulnerability is being conceptualized in reproductive discourse. So my point is different from Haraway's in saying that we have to look at how and by whom this vulnerability is being constructed and for whom especially. We can surely observe an increase in the use of visualizing technologies in prenatal care since the 90s, and a simultaneous depoliticization of these images. The fetus, as cultural anthropologist Lisa Mitchell observed, just a few years after Haraway's analysis, has become a rather individualized figure of vulnerability and endangerment. Mitchell writes, "In approaching ultrasound images as if they were baby's first picture, we are letting our attention be drawn toward individual women, fetuses, and families as sites of vulnerability and endangerment, and away from the social sources of anxiety, distress, risk, and loss during pregnancy. It is as if the ultrasound images seen each year in Canada by tens of thousands of pregnant women, spouses, kin, and co-workers have only personal significance, and none that is cultural or political." End of quote. In the same vein, feminist theorist Laurie Oakes has argued that, I quote, "a particular type of fetal person, coded as a vulnerable agent in need of, if not demanding, vigilant protection, is at the center of health policy, legal, and social debates." End of quote. If, however, vulnerability keeps being conceptualized in universalistic terms, as in bioethics and prenatal biomedical care, it clearly confronts us with a discrepancy, or what I call a paradox, that might be just our way out of such normative practices. So remembering Devlina's point about how the education not being refusing the hegemonic system is actually more subversive. So I'm hoping I'm making a similar point here. Vulnerability in the universalistic and normative sense is bound to be eliminated in order to avoid bodily states of suffering, abnormality, and disability, and in order to create so-called perfect human beings. This approach to vulnerability identifies those who require extra care and seeks to eliminate their vulnerability for the benefit of the subjects as well as for the state and society at large. The discrepancy for prenatal care, however, arises from the difficulty or the impossibility to identify the integrity of the fetal figure, as if it were an autonomous subject. The biomedically constructed link between the autonomous fetal persona and the ethical call for the elimination of vulnerability fails to hold here, since the fetus is only ever autonomous in its vulnerability, and vice versa. For fetal life, personhood and autonomy are culturally or medically constructed in ways that depend on the fetus's fertility and that neglect the intertwined physical, affective, and social relationship between expectant mother and unborn life. In order to counter this convoluted discourse about fetal vulnerability, I take my own pregnancy experiences of confusion about how to relate to an emergent life form that is simultaneously unavailable to, yet part of oneself, as an opportunity for imagining alternative relations. The fetal life form is routinely conjured as visual, emotional, and moral signifier through medical technology and social discourse. Yet it remains always partially removed from cultural access. I believe that the ungraspable nature of a growing fetus, what I call the transitional gender of an expectant mother, and the historical anxiety about the imaginative power of mothers over their offspring, have repressed the reproductive body's own ways of relating to the enigma of fetal life. the inherent vulnerability of pregnant embodiment has shifted towards the fetus, who, constructed as a vulnerable person, can now be monitored under a normative regime of biomedical control over life. Okay. My motivation here is to formulate a critique of these normative sentiments towards unborn life and the surveillance of the maternal-fetal relationship. I do this by way of fictional pregnancy narratives, which disrupt the cultural imagination of the mother as morally responsible for nurturing a constructed vulnerability in future life, and which offer ways of relating to what I call unavailable life in ways that are less dependent on the construction of the fetus as vulnerable other. I want to stress that I'm here not criticizing the practices of medical reproductive technology or standards of care for pregnant subjects, but that I'm pointing to a crucial connection and discrepancy between medical controlling devices which monitor pregnancies and the act of imagination involved in relating to unborn life. In an article on imagining mothering, literary theorist Gillian Osborne describes how, I quote, "imagination makes unavailable bodies visible, but only inwardly. Motherhood puts a body into the world. Motherhood therefore makes imagination real, while also making bodies both more real and more imaginary." End of quote. And she continues, "Not only mothering needs to be imagined. We need to imagine the conditions that enable or delimit what it means for choice itself to be an imaginative act." On this note, I want to start imagining vulnerability in the reproductive process differently. In order to offer a possible alternative to the ethical demand on maternal behavior in pregnancies, I conjure a different set of imaginations with the help of the fictional work of Kelly McGee and Carol Guess in a collection of short stories entitled With Animal. It was published in 2015. In this small book, human parents of various sexes are pregnant with and give birth to animal babies or meteorological phenomena. They hatch their offspring, raise them, lick them, care for them, let them go, and thereby reimagine their own desires and fears in the face of uncontrolled and seemingly more risky forms of procreation. The queer post-human imaginations of reproduction in these literary narratives urge us to scrutinize and reimagine the cultural construction of vulnerability in reproductive subjects. The reproductive body has historically been shaped by practices of restraint and regulation as a result of a cultural imaginary which has seen unborn life as a potential threat, but not to a human future per se, but rather to a future of a specific moral order. So the idea that unborn life could possibly be abnormal, that it could produce bodies that are unwelcome, would be the threat rather than the fact that human life is being reproduced. Against this background of biomedicalized and moral control over life, I will take what I call the post-human body as the starting point for a more effective and creative approach to human vulnerability. The following quote is from a story about a pregnant subject's encounter with the ultrasound imaging of her womb. It remains unclear throughout the story if she is pregnant at all, if she is bearing twins of different species, or if what she sees is a combination of imagination and the ultrasound imaging of her intestines rather than the fetus. So this story is called With Nebula. You are there and not there. Visible on one ultrasound, nearly gone by the next. On the movie screen over the examination table, A haze of lights, constellations flashing and whirring, everything so busy, pulsing and sliding and shape-shifting, bone and muscle, brain and tissue. And off to the side, next to all the motion, I see you, a pebble of solidity, a seed, a mass of motionlessness, dark. You are baby B, a vanishing twin, in the process of unbecoming. I can watch it on the screen, the fade, the shrink, the way you are beginning to condense and condense into what never was. Bits of you flaking off. You could be anything at all. Goldfish, planaria, star. A mixed up mashup of genes, animal and human, human and astral, real and un. Whatever it was, it didn't work. The word the ultrasound tech uses is reabsorbed. Though the more I think about it, the less sense that makes. You are not being absorbed again. The first time was a striking out, a leap, the opposite of assimilation. You will not go back the way you came. You move into new territory, fanning out. Part of me and not part of me at all, the way the healthy one, the human one, baby A, becomes. There she is, though I don't yet know she's a she, thrusting forward, broadening, differentiating, separating into detail. The line between us is so clear, so easy to locate on this map. Not so for you. You'll have no labor, no birth. Instead of pushing, we relax. Instead of contracting, we expand. Each cell becomes less distinct but more itself. You will never be anything but baby B. This thence not. These broken strands of DNA unwinding, these peeling layers, face and sex and potential, released into the wilds of my body, where there is only and always the two of us, which is one of us, which is you vanishing and me grab it. You are the part of me that recedes over and over. I can stay here as long as I like, the ultrasound tech says. And I think I would like to stay here, perpetually full of you, unable to hold and yet always holding you, without touch, like breath, like fullness. You are buoyancy and flux. You are the opposite of weight. End of quote. What we encounter in this narrative is the possibility for a non-personified, non-normative, non-gendered, non-racialized, and highly unpredictable affective relation of the expectant mother to her unborn, unbound offspring. She encounters it through ultrasound technology, but experiences a radically different vision from the one usually relayed by the ultrasound technician. The fetus in this story does not carry with it a new or heightened sense of vulnerability. It also does not present itself in any clearly bounded or identifiable form that could be linked to the concept of autonomy. Rather, the pregnant subject relates to this fetal other in ways which attest to a shared dependency, a reflective and transformative fragility, and to the imagination of the unborn beyond expectations of a future life or even beyond the event of birth. The fetus here is not even figured as a fetus, thereby defying the attribution of vulnerability and the need for protection. Also, this fetus does not produce a sense of futurity, which is often the only culturally imaginable horizon in reproductive discourse. In this literary narrative, the visual medical device of the ultrasound machine is reinterpreted and serves as a medium for creative reimagination and affection towards the fetus in ways beyond a normative conception of vulnerability. Yet, the mother and the fetal phenomena remain vulnerable in ways that are possibly more effective and more planetary. So these I would call ultrasound images after nebula. These are images from one of my own pregnancies, reading After Nebula, which would be the story, opened up new ways of looking at and seeing these images. Less as a manifestation of a vulnerable fetus, and more as a technologically contoured fantasy that allowed for, on the one hand, more interpretive space, but also produced less anxiety and expectations. So I chose, of course, these pictures over others, but these are also pictures that you get to see when you see ultrasound images of your fetus. And if you think of After Nebula and look at these images, you can see how you can actually see differently. So with a different approach to the images, you can actually see different images. The following quote from With Animal is from a story called With Fish, in which we encounter a productive shift from biomedical technological representation of a womb's insides towards an image of another kind of vulnerability, a vulnerability dependent on the surrounding circumstances and not on conceptions of autonomy. It took 3 days for her to tell me about the phone call, her doctor calling to confess a mistake. He'd inseminated her with the wrong injection, wrong needle, wrong species. She was pregnant with fish. The aquarium took up half the room, big enough to climb inside, which she did the first night, naked except for her mask and tank. Silhouettes crowded at the edge of her stomach like koi in a pond. Towards the end, she slept in the tank, her belly glowing like a nightlight. The fish were born so quietly, neither of us noticed. I woke to find my girlfriend missing and the room dark. I turned on a light and saw the school of fish moving around her as a single entity. She didn't wake. The fish startled at the light and rushed back inside her. And like that, they were unborn again. Her fish babies didn't grow. Instead, more of her insides flashed on, transparent. I could see her organs now, one of the shape of a treasure chest, one a skull and crossbones. Her chest glassed over, and there was her heart bubbling. I could see all the way through her. In the tank, seaweed blew like hair. The fish followed each other's slightest movements, tracking shapes that looked like a body. End of quote. Unborn life here is life entangled with living and dying bodies, codependent subjects, affections, and material contexts. This entanglement also means that the borders between non-life and life, or between humane and non-humane life, become blurry. The swarm of fish suggests a form of life that is unavailable or unimaginable despite the mother's body's transparency. It is neither more nor less vulnerable through revealing itself to vision. The specific vision imagined in this story allows us to see that the creation of life is always socially, materially, and affectively entangled with other life, as is our shared vulnerability. The acknowledgement of this entanglement is important also for critically reflecting about current medical practice, which not only aims to reduce the risks of unborn life, but which also thereby produces human types that fit the current biopolitic. If we relate the recognition of entangled vulnerability to the common pregnancy experience, we can observe a more complex and yet morally forming demand of the expectant mother, who is asked to imagine, predict, and reproduce not only the emotional response of her unborn child, but also to do it through the mediation of medical technology, conjuring for her a scenario that is normatively constructed and restricts a more sensory, affective, or ecologically sensible response. Finally, I hope that the alternative reproductive narratives so provocatively told in With Animal might allow us to recognize the technological violence performed on reproductive bodies, while acknowledging instead of eliminating the fragility of all reproductive processes. With animal does not imagine fetal life as necessarily vulnerable and therefore in need of medical and maternal protection under moral guidance. It instead offers an account of vulnerability that shifts, grows, subsides, transforms all subjects involved in the reproductive process. The stories thereby create the possibility to relate to vulnerability not in paternalistic and morally prescriptive ways, but rather in ways that embrace the unknown, the unpredictable, and the transient nature of fetal life. Very briefly, to conclude, I want to say that I am quite concerned about this new conservatism that hijacked the concept of vulnerability in ways that instrumentalizes and heightens the already existing social and bodily fragility of women, people with disabilities, and queer reproductive subjects, or other marginalized people. The construction of what I call hegemonic vulnerability is a danger to the critical and ethical potential of vulnerability as a cultural concept. Yet its paradoxical nature might be seen as a chance to disrupt hegemonic bodily discourses and practices. Therefore, I want to ask, what can we gain from a critique of the construction of fetal vulnerability as a new embodied norm? And how would alternative types of vulnerability in reproductive care have to look like to counter this new normalizing instrument? I feel that we need to develop a disruptive and denormativizing concept of vulnerability in theory, but also I believe that we need specific forms of art, like also queer poetics, like the one I quoted, or other radical cultural interventions to disrupt the ideological power of the visualizing technologies involved in creating fetal citizenship.